Computer. Okay, I press that then. Okay. All right. So, okay. Play slideshow. All right. Hopefully we're recording now. Thanks, Nadine. All right. Good. So the winter food garden. So this is a picture of early in the year of the things that I pulled out of my food garden when I was doing an interview on the radio, actually, with Don Genova came by. And I thought, well, interview on the radio, not very visual. I'll just run out and pull up a basket of goodies, and then we can talk about these things to the listeners. And so we had chickens then, so there are eggs in this photo as well. But basically, this is just a sample of the kinds of foods that we were pulling out of the garden. There's mint there, and edible calendula flowers as well, and chard and beets and onions, which were grown over the winter, some storage garlic, some artichokes, which are ready right now. The globe artichokes are harvesting right now. Leeks and all sorts of greens, like plenty of winter greens. So it's not boring winter vegetable garden. There's a huge diversity of different things that you can grow here throughout the winter. And I'm not going to go on about saving money, although I will too, because I mean, you know, money doesn't grow on trees, so they said. Good morning, Kim. Thanks for joining. But, you know, there is a massive savings to be had here. If you go out and have to buy all your own food. And yesterday, the assignment for the students at the School of Nutrition was to write an essay about the effects of COVID-19 on our food supply and the food system in general. And actually several of the students worked at grocery stores, Country Grocer, etc., Save On Foods. And they said they were shocked because already they're seeing price spikes, $20 a pound for cherries, for example, and for broccoli, and some of the things that we sort of take for granted are suddenly becoming extremely expensive. So, you know, for all these reasons, and just for food security in general, I hung this sign up in my garden all year round because basically our objective was to grow all our own food. And that is what we were doing. And in addition to having things bottled and fermented and in the freezer, there was plenty of fresh produce in the garden right through the year. And so if for some reason your beds are still empty and you've got space, this is a really good time to add food plants to them, because the winter food gardening is the easiest of any of the growing throughout the year, because you don't have weeding, there's no insect problems in the winter time, you don't have to worry about the watering, basically you just have to go out there and harvest. So it's a really almost, once you've, the thing is about the timing and getting the stuff in the ground on time, and then just letting it go right through the winter months. And this is, sorry, somebody got a comment? No? Okay. So this is basically what a trip into my garden at the start of the year looked like, with a huge bunch of choices of things to be harvested there. So nothing boring about winter food gardening. And, you know, there were just two of us living in this house in Saanich. And you can see that there's like more food there. We could have fed the whole street and neighborhood because it's so abundant, the garden, and rows and rows and rows of different types of vegetables. Growing close packed together. And then, you know, simple things that you can do without spending any money is just recycling glass window frames, and some, we had some old paneling here, and we were built some coal frames over some lettuces and spinach, and just to keep it protected over the winter. But you can see that there's a row of salad lettuce right there, already fine. And what happens in the winter, if you choose the cold hardy varieties of lettuce like Winter Density and Brunia, for example, Rouge d'Hiver, they're all winter lettuces, is that they may, if there's a really hard frost, die down to the ground. But as long as the roots are still in place, then in the spring, or when it starts to turn and the weather warms up a little bit, that those lettuces will come back and regenerate. So you can just leave them even if they die down. I've experienced them to come back. And this year we've got an 80-foot bed of winter squash. So we'll separate the summer squash like the zucchini and the patipan and trumboncini and things like that from the winter squash. So the winter squash is all about winter food. It stores and it can be used for a multiple of recipes. So I include that as part of the diet in winter. And really good value for money, because some of these plants like the spaghetti squash are very prolific, and the butternut and the buttercup, I mean, are fantastic long-term storage. They'll go right through till March or something like that. The key thing about the winter squash is that you have to wipe them off when you get them with a 10% hydrogen peroxide or bleach, if you use bleach, solution, just to destroy any bacteria on the skin of the squash. Because if you store them and there's still dirt on them, then that can cause a rotting. So you want to just wipe them off and then bring them into the house. You know when to harvest them, because the cork, the stem, by which they are attached to the plant, turns corky, goes brown. And that's an indication that the squash is ripe, mature, and that you can now separate it from the vine. And so with winter squash, you want to leave them attached to the plant for as long as possible until that the attachment is like this corky color, and then cut that off, wipe them off, and then bring them into the house, actually, or into a cool, dry place. And we just line them up in the living room, or into a cool place where they can sit, where it's not too humid, so you don't want them rotting, and they'll just go right through the winter for you. So with the winter squash, there's all sorts of varieties like Hubbard, pumpkins, spaghetti delicata, acorn, the list goes on. But we've missed the window of opportunity now, unless somebody's got a good sized squash plant to get planted. They should be in the ground and growing along at the moment. The other thing is potatoes is another thing that would be included in your winter food as storage potatoes. You know, you could probably leave your potatoes in the ground if you wanted to. If your soil is drained, unless it's wet, because then your tubers will probably rot out. But you can also bring them out of the ground. You harvest them for storage. You want to wait until the potato plant is fully died back. All the foliage has died down to the ground, because then the skin on the potatoes is developed and rough, tough, and they're ready for storage. So russets are a well-known variety for storing. The Sieglinde is what Goldie has chosen to grow this year, so we're not sure about the storage time for them, but we are going to allow them to mature and then to let them dry. We're not going to wash them, we're just going to pull them out, brush off the soil, dry them, and then store them. And so you should be able to eat your own potatoes right through the winter. And this is a friend of mine, Dan Jason, actually, they're potatoes that they grew, and they built a special storage hut for them, and they just harvested the whole field. And these were for their own consumption, but they were also for sale. So they had a lot of potatoes there for they had devoted a large area to growing potatoes. Garlic as well. This is garlic is hanging to cure. When the garlic comes out, which will be happening in the next 2 to 3 weeks, all your garlic should be out by the end of July, and you'll know when it's the right time to harvest the garlic because the tops, 2/3 of the tops of the plants will have turned yellow, and that indicates that the bulbs are mature. The important thing about garlic is you want to harvest it before the bulbs crack open and separate. So the idea is that the bulb is fully formed, has distinguished, has become separated, the cloves are distinct within the bulb, but that the cloves have not started to open up, they're still together as one tight bulb. If they have split open by any chance, you have to eat that garlic, it won't be good for storage. The hardneck, the ones that have the scapes, the rocambole types of garlic, will store for about 8 months. And if you're growing soft neck varieties of garlic, which are braidable, they actually will store longer. They'll store for up to a year. So ideally what we should have is a situation where we have enough garlic handy throughout the winter that'll keep us going until the next crop of garlic is coming out, and we'll start again, well, as we have been with eating the scapes, and we're into a new cycle now. So garlic, we'll be talking more about garlic as a subject on its own later on when we get into planting, and we'll be doing a major thing with pulling out the garlic and curing it. So again, we have a climate that allows us to grow masses of leafy greens, nutritious, vitamin-enriched leafy greens for the winter, making kale chips. People use this one. This is the black Tuscan or blue Tuscan kale from Italy, or lacinato. It's or dinosaur. Some people call this dinosaur kale because it can grow absolutely huge. I've had plants 5 feet tall of this kale, almost dwarfing me in the field. Lots of different types of kale to choose from. We can grow these turnips, which are not necessarily a crop which will go right through the winter. So then let's say, what are we talking about when we're talking about winter vegetables? We're basically talking about food that will be available to us from October right through till April the following year. So any of food that falls within that time frame is categorized as a winter vegetable. And not all of them will be there for you right through the winter, like some things, like the purple sprouting broccoli. It's got a days to maturity of 220 days, which obviously indicates that it's not going to produce anything until the spring, until the next year, early on in the next year. So we don't expect to be harvesting sprouting broccoli until March, April, but we still talk about it as a winter vegetable. These turnips are amazing. They're really fast growing. You can plant these to have September or August to have a crop of those in October, November. And leeks are my absolute favorites. We've got 2 different types of leeks growing. Be sure that you order the winter leeks rather than the autumn giant, for example. Tells you right there in the name of the leek that it is not an overwintering leek. So things like Durabel or Siegfried Frost leeks, I'll tell you in the catalogue, which are overwintering. And these need to be in place already by now because they're slow growing. And as they go through the year, they get fatter and they get more and more blanched. But, and I love them, the leeks, to be pulling out and thinning them. These are kind of like baby leeks, which are the most delicious and tender. So thinning your leek patch will yield a crop of these. So this is what we're going to be doing this afternoon. seeding winter vegetables, but we are working in cell trays rather than punnets. But for my nursery, I started selling winter vegetables and doing talks about winter vegetable gardening and educating people about how much food could be grown throughout these months, rather than leaving the garden empty and bare. And we would grow them in punnets because we'd be selling these. I would open every year at the end of August into the first week of September, which is exactly the right time to transplant your transplants into the garden. And this is a production thing because we were growing such quantities. So we would lay out our trays, our punnets. We would use our propagation mix to fill the punnets with. And we wouldn't pre-moisten it. We don't usually do that. We usually work dry. It's a choice, but with the cell trays, we will pre-moisten. But with the punnets, we just find it easier to work with this mix when it's dry and then water after we've seeded. So they're all filled, level, and then it's a question of seeding. And so we're actually direct seeding into the punnets sparingly, with the idea that people would be able to come and buy a little tray full of seedlings to transplant into their own garden. And this is like the easiest thing to do because you don't need any protection. You don't need a greenhouse or anything like that. You don't need any light. You don't need any heat. You can do this outside. You can grow them on outside. After seeding, we just tamped down the seeds, press them into the potting mix, and then we lightly covered them and wet them all down and labeled them. And basically, then we just moved them into the backyard onto these pallets, just off the ground, keep them away from the bugs. And we would grow our winter vegetables on outside. And so this is what it looked like. You can see that the plants are all off the ground, because the key thing here was earwigs, pillbugs, and slugs, which would be a problem. And what we used to do is we would take a flat and we would turn the flat upside down, a carrying flat, and we would put the tray of seedlings on top of the carrying flat. And that was all we needed to do to stop the bugs from eating the plants, because they couldn't get access. They couldn't hang out underneath the flat because there was air and space under there, and they couldn't get access into the flat of plants to do any damage. And so that was like the easiest solution for bug control. And then 7 to 10 days after seeding, we would see the flush of green. You don't want them to be in full sun, ideally. It doesn't really matter that much, but you'd have to water more if they are. They're cool weather plants. So in a shady place where it's sort of cool and it's filtered light, just keep them moist. And in no time at all, we would have trays absolutely jam-packed with food plants that look like this. And as I said, I would open my nursery to the public for winter vegetable sales for 1 week at the end of August into early September, and I would make $10,000 in that 1 week of selling these food plants to people. And in the beginning, people didn't know what winter vegetables were. They were confused, and I had to sort of educate people as to what was possible. And in the beginning, people were tentative, and they came and they said, oh, I'll just give it a try and I'll grow a few things and we'll see. In the end, I had a cult following. It was incredible. And people would come with a couple of trays, carrying trays, and load them all up and just take almost one of everything. And they were so excited and so enamored by, wow, we had no idea, you know, that we could have all this food in our garden over the winter, and I'm going to grow a lot more. So it really, really took off. And it actually, this is a true story, it got to the point where so many people came to get their winter vegetables that the neighbors called the police. And we had the cops come down to investigate what was going on in the garden. And all these people swarming around with their trays of food plants. And the cop said to me, "Who's in charge here?" I said, "Oh, I am, officer." And he said, "What's going on? You know, we've had complaints about traffic and disruption." And I said, "Oh, well, it's just, we're having a sale of winter vegetables, officer." "What?" he said. "I can't believe it." He was like talking into his walkie-talkie to, you know, tell the others what was happening. And he said, "I've never seen so many people in a garden centre at one time before. You know, this is outrageous." And I said, "Oh, yes, well, you know, if you grew winter vegetables, you know, you'd probably get excited too." Anyway, that was Saturday. Sunday, we were just opening up and two female cops on bicycles came down the driveway, and we looked at each other and said, "Oh no, here we go, more trouble, right?" And they got off their bikes and they said, "Oh, we heard all this going on the walkie-talkie yesterday. We're so intrigued, we have to come and get some winter vegetables." So, okay, great. So that was a funny story. And yeah, so it's just for a week. But, you know, as I said to people, if anybody wants to make some extra money this year, then just grow a few winter vegetables and put out a little table or something. But the trick to doing this in punnets is seeding sparingly, not to overcrowd the plants so that you can separate them out. And in some cases, I just literally do hoe a row 5 and I just plant the whole punnet with no separation at all and just let them grow thickly together. And in the winter, this is overwintering Walla Walla onions, which you can grow them in the spring to harvest them in the fall. But you can also plant them in the fall and have them grow over the winter to harvest them the following June. So if you want early onions, that's the timing for those. Walla Wallas can be planted as a winter crop as well. And they're not storage onions, they're sweet-eating onions. So when you're picking your leafy greens and your lettuces, for example, winter density lettuces, make sure you're choosing the hardy ones with the icicle asterisks from the catalogue, and just make sure it says cold hardy overwintering. There's all sorts of oriental greens as well. They're very fast growing, 50 days or something for a quick crop of bok choy, pak choy, tatsoi. The oriental vegetables are very easy to grow, very fast. Actually, I prefer to direct seed them rather than to transplant them, because with transplanting, you run the risk of bolting to seed too quickly. With direct seeding, that doesn't happen. So I recommend direct seeding for those things. This is a winter density overwintering lettuce, and brunia, which is a red leafy lettuce that can be grown in the cool part of the year. And also, if you don't have access to a garden, you can grow in planter boxes. And I actually, in my greenhouse, I had some planter boxes. I filled them up with a compost mix and just grew a selection of beets and lettuces, some bitter greens, radicchio, some peas. So I could go into the greenhouse and harvest. This is just a sample of what I was pulling out of my boxes in the greenhouse right through the winter. So we have mustard greens and radicchio, 2 different types, endive and lettuce there, so, and some calendula blossoms. You can actually make a really nice salad in the winter time with some fresh greens from your own backyard. And I really like these. People are not so fond of bitter greens. They're very healthy for us. We have yet to acquire a taste for them. But in the Mediterranean diet, they play a huge role. you can have them as an appetizer in small quantities, or you can add them to a salad. But you don't necessarily want to eat just these because they do have a bitter flavor to them. But they're beautiful in the garden. And I discovered that they would actually produce and be ready for a fall harvest. Cut out the center, leave the roots and the older leaves in place, and then bingo, they would actually come back with 5 or 6 smaller heads. So they went on, and then they'd revive in the spring. So they were interesting because they actually had a really long season of harvest. And they're beautiful plants too. I think something you could grow in a flower border as well for their ornamental value. This is arugula. This is what it looks like on the farm right now. It's extremely fast from a direct seeding, and it'll go through. You want to, if you're going to grow arugula now, you want to make sure it's in the shade because it's getting hot now. You don't really want to have these things in full blasting sun when they prefer to be cooler. We're just letting them go to seed and collect seed from them later on. We have a big patch on the farm at the moment, waiting to mature. I think it'll be ready next week to start saving seeds of arugula. And you know this about these rocket salad. The greens are mild when they're young, the small immature leaves are tender and mild flavored and a little bit of a bite. But as you leave them, the heat builds up. And yesterday we had some of the students try some of our mustard greens, which are now mature and starting to bolt to seed. And they're mouth-searingly hot. Really for those people that like really, really hot things to eat. So that way you know that you do them, maybe you get 3 harvests out of them, and you can cut and come again, harvest them by scissors or a knife and cutting them right down to the ground and letting them come back again, and up to about 3 harvests before letting them go to seed. And maybe some of you enjoy the hotter leaves of the more mature arugula. And this is a close-up of the perennial arugula. This is the wild one, the sylvetta, arugula sylvetta. Sylvetta, I think, means of the woods or something like that. And it is a little sub-shrub, actually, and it does get woody at the base, and it shoots out all these leaves. And you can see they're different from the annual arugula, and they have a different flavor too. And some people say they prefer the flavor of the wild arugula. And I recommend having this in the garden. It's permaculture, perennial plant. The only thing I don't recommend is letting it go to seed, because this thing will seed itself everywhere. So be on top of that and cut the seeds off before they spread all over the garden. The watercress, I love this watercress. It does actually not grow in water, or despite the name. It's jam-packed with vitamin C. I love the flavor. When I was eating eggs, it was delicious on an egg sandwich or in an egg salad. But this is a land cress, and there are a lot of cresses actually. And I don't mind these self-seeding around the garden. It's just a nice thing to go out and be able to pick leaves and add them to salads at any time of year, and nothing to think about because they're just volunteering. The watercress actually is a half-hardy annual. It doesn't stay very long. It's very low to the ground, and it's a little ground cover, but then it quite quickly will flower and go to seed, and then it'll seed itself. So I suggest this having a patch of its own at the edge of the garden, just let it do its own thing. Corn salad, mâché, is very, very popular in Europe, in Germany in particular. It's a staple. Corn salad is a wonderful winter green. It isn't really spicy. It doesn't have, you know, it has its own distinct flavor. It's not that flavorful, but it's very nutritious, and it's a great thing to add to sandwiches or salads. And it's extremely cold hardy. This is during a massive frost, and this is what my bed of corn salad looked like when it was locked down. It was literally, I mean, you'd think that that was dead, but as soon as that frost passed and thawed, it bounced back again. So they can take a deep freeze. And how it works actually with winter vegetables is that the cells in the leaves of the plants, they convert starch to sugar. And they use this as an antifreeze. This actually stops them from dying during a deep freeze. And the reason why your kale, for example, tastes so sweet in the winter after it's been hit by frost is because of this conversion of starch to sugar. And as soon as you pick your kale or any other of your other leafy greens in winter, then that changes. The sugar converts back to starch. So for that reason, going out into your yard in the winter, picking your greens is the sweetest way that you're ever going to experience them. Because if you're going to buy a bunch of kale or whatever from the supermarket, you have no idea how long it's been since that vegetable was harvested, and those the starches will be back dominating the sweetness, and so you don't get that. Guy and I just love lightly steamed Russian kale in the Russian red or Russian white in the winter is so delicious. we actually always comment on how sweet it is. And that's the same for all the winter greens. And the mustards are so easy to grow, and they're really winter hardy, and there's quite a mix of them. You can go from the mild Mizuna to the more spicy mustards like Osaka Purple. The mustard Ruby Streaks, this one, is so winter hardy. It's also extremely ornamental. And it just sails right through the winter, no matter what the weather's doing, and it can be harvested throughout, and it's got a very mild flavor. So I totally recommend Ruby Streaks as being a great addition to the winter garden. And then we have the chards and the perpetual spinach. This is actually perpetual spinach. I love spinach. It's very quick. It comes and goes. It's all over within about a month, and it bolts to seed if you try transplanting it. So it's a little tricky. So I opt for the perpetual spinach, which is a cross between beet greens and chard greens, and it eats just like spinach, but doesn't have the oxalic acid of spinach, which coats your tongue with that kind of furry coating. You don't get that with perpetual spinach. It also seeds itself everywhere and just crops up again. So it's one of these things that you can grow just once and let it go, and it'll always come back. Very, very productive and very nice to have in your garden for like a vegetarian lasagna, for example, fantastic, made with perpetual spinach. And with the chards, I find that the bright lights or the celebration rainbow, whatever they call it now, it's got all these different names, is not only extremely attractive for the color, but it's the most winter hardy of the chards. The rhubarb chard I found is a bit borderline, and the other chards don't always make it through. I mean, they would if you put them under plastic or inside a coal frame. But this bright lights chard is more resistant to winter cold. And I think of this vegetable as having 2 in 1, because the stalks are thick and can be eaten like celery. They can be regarded as a vegetable on their own. They can be sliced and sauteed in stir fries. They can be steamed and then have a nice sauce poured over them, as you would maybe with celery. And the leaves are plentiful and abundant. So you've got the leaf and the stalk there as two separate food plants almost, and they can be eaten at the same time, of course. And when I went to England, I bought this seed back with me. It's called Silverado, and I just think it's an incredibly superior chard. It's got really thick white stalks, and which are delicious and tender and crunchy, and wonderful dark green succulent leaves. And I grew this for years, the Silverado chard. And again, these things will self-seed if you allow them to drop a few seeds. They will come back. And I think I told you the story of my friend Bill. I went to visit in April, and he had some raised beds in boxes in his backyard, and they were all absolutely stuffed with leafy greens. And I said, wow, you know, fantastic, Bill. You grew some great food there this winter. And he said, I didn't grow any of it. He said, it's all volunteer. It just came back. Oh, okay, that's even better. Oh, he had spinach and chard and kale and all sorts of things there. So they were eating out of those for the winter. And this is the Silverado again, just showing you that midrib. And it's a very nice vegetable. And then the kales, this is the Russian red kale. It's serrated, edged, very fine texture, thin. Not everybody likes strong cabbagey flavor. And this is the kale which I say you can eat raw. You can just tear it into salads and mix it in. Not so much for kale chips. The tougher leaved kales are better for baking as kale chips. But this one is prolific, and it's really tough and goes through the winter no problem, and even would act as a perennial in some situations where you could have it for 2 or 3 years. As this one, I grew this one 4 years in a trot before it finally diminished and became less productive. This is the red ball kale, purple leaf kale. This is a 5-minute whole row and 5 row of kale, which provided us with masses of greens right throughout the winter. And then we're going back to the lacinato kale now. This one here, a lot of people find it very strong. It's coarse textured. So it isn't everyone's favorite, but as I said, this is the one that a lot of people make kale chips from. And again, this looks fantastic. This would be a great ornamental plant in a perennial border. It's got these glaucous silvery grey leaves, and it's quite stunning when it gets to maturity because it's a big plant. And they call this one dinosaur kale too, probably because of its size. And now we're talking about something which is very unusual, which is Cranby maritima or sea kale. This naturalizes on the northwest coast of the British Isles. It's maritima means it's a seaside plant, withstands the wind and the salt sprays from the ocean if you live by the ocean. And its edible features are the stalks that come out of the ground in the winter. And the Victorians used to savor this plant. It has a flavor of asparagus and hazelnuts crossed together. So it has its own unique eating quality, and people were very fond of sea kale. It was considered a delicacy, and it's perennial, so it's a good permaculture plant. And it's actually, you would do is you would force it like rhubarb under a terracotta pot for the shoots to come up in January. And that's when they're available for eating. And then later on, you can let it go. And this is what it does. And it flowers with these pure white sprays of flowers, very, very showy in the garden, another ornamental edible. So cranberry, we have grown some cranberry. Actually, I have a few plants if anybody wants to try it. And it can be propagated by root division. It's very easy if you get cranberry and then just chop up the roots, and every part of that root will produce another plant. This is one of our students, Henry, growing, he's actually just harvested the cabbages. Cabbages are wonderful winter vegetable plants. This one is January king cabbage, so the name indicates it's a winter cabbage, but this was actually in June. I don't know what happened that year. They don't always go according to schedule, but there's a beautiful cabbage, the January king, solid heads on them, and I had a whole mass bed of those. This is purple sprouting broccoli. Again, I just mentioned that a lot of people would phone me up and say, Carolyn, you know, I bought your broccoli and nothing's happening. I've got masses of foliage, but I've got no broccoli. And I'd say, just hang on a bit, because this one is got 220 days to maturity. It's slow growing, gets really big and bushy, and then sprouts and starts pumping out these spears of broccoli sprouts, and that they go on for about 6 weeks. And I've grown the white one to the purple one, and this is called 9-star sprouting broccoli, and it took me a long time to find a decent white sprouting broccoli. And wow, this is really delicious flavor. So if you ever come across the 9-star, grab some, because it's a really delicious plant. I guess it's kind of like eating cauliflower, you know, after it's sort of burst its head and sprouted. But this one is definitely broccoli, and that's a really good one. And we used to offer the seed in our seed catalogue. But normally broccoli doesn't overwinter. It will freeze out, except last year we showed you on the farm, and we're saving seed of it. We actually had an F1 broccoli that sailed through the winter, and then went on now to going to seed, and is actually, I just had some of that broccoli for dinner last night, has started to regrow like a perennial and is now pumping out shoots of broccoli. So I don't know. If you have room in your garden to leave these things, you know, and allow them to come back, you can get more than 1 year's production from them. But we'll be saving seed of that and experimenting with it, because having a broccoli that goes through the winter is worth a lot. And this is another basket of what was in my garden for dinner. We've got Moscow parsley, that's hardy, that will sail through. We've got chive blossoms, chives are winter hardy. We've got the purple sprouting broccoli and the white sprouting broccoli, and then we've got the chard. So, you know, that's lots of delicious food there for winter eating. And this is a cauliflower. Cauliflower is a little bit more challenging to grow. They need a really high fertile soil and lots of nitrogen. This one's called Purple Cape cauliflower. It's a heritage variety, and yeah, quite unusual to have this different coloured cauliflower, but that was winter hardy, and that's worth growing. And I just planted Brussels sprout transplants on the farm the other day, and hopefully we're going to get some good Brussels sprouts as a result. I personally have found it challenging to find, first of all, the seed for Brussels sprouts is really expensive. And secondly, not all Brussels sprouts grow well. They will actually produce these are like little miniature cabbages on a stalk, but they'll blow open, and they won't form the nice tight little heads for the Brussels sprouts. So it's all about timing with Brussels sprouts. They should be planted, they should be seeded in May actually, and you can get them in the ground, and then you should be able to eat them for Thanksgiving. It's a fall harvest, and then you should be able to just pick the sprouts off. They don't all mature at the same time. You should be able to pick the largest ones off first, and then you should be able to go through the winter with them and harvesting them as they mature throughout the winter. And if with any luck, you can leave them in the ground and let them go to seed the following spring. But timing again with the Brussels sprouts. And celery is challenging to grow. Some people have luck with it. Actually, I've never had much luck with getting a decent crop of celery out. It's always been very fibrous-y and chewy and not particularly flavorful, not watery and crunchy. And then I went to buy some eggs from my neighbor once back in Victoria, and I was amazed to see that she had a box near her front door absolutely loaded with celery, absolutely enormous heads of celery. And I said, wow, I said, what's your secret to growing celery like that? And she said, oh, I go to the store and I buy celery, organic celery, and I just chop the base off it and I plant it. And this is all, it roots and goes and carries on growing. I was like, really? Okay, that sounds like the way to do it. So if any of you want to experiment with your celery next time you buy some, you can just chop off the base and put it in the garden and see what happens, and it should regrow again. So rather than growing celery, which is tough and chewy, I choose to grow celeriac. You can grow this from seed. The seed is in the Umbelliferae family, which means that it needs to be fresh, otherwise it won't germinate. And they form baseball-sized roots, which are delicious. And they're very heavy in celery flavor and really good steamed just by themselves. But what I do is I do a leek and potato soup, and then I will add chopped celeriac in to the soup, and that makes an absolutely delicious winter soup, warming, and they can sit in the ground for a while. So the celeriac can be seeded to go right through the winter and then pulled out into the early spring. Beets actually also are winter hardy. You might want to, depending on your soil, root vegetables in very wet soil, not a good idea because of rotting. But if you've got a raised bed or a lasagna bed, or your soil dries out well during the winter, you can carry beets through the winter, and you can mulch them with leaves if you gather some leaves. Just to protect them and give them a little bit of frost protection if you want to. That'll help them get through. And you can be pulling them out and enjoying beets, sweet beets, right through the winter. The variety that I used to grow was called Lutz, L-U-T-Z, or they now also show up as they're called Winter Keeper. The wonderful thing about these is that the greens is another two vegetables in one here, because you've got the roots, you've also got the tops, and the tops of the Winter Keeper are extremely sweet and very good eating quality. And so it's a matter of experimentation. Like we're growing 4 different kinds of beets at Kiwi Cove, and on the farm Goldie's got 3 different kinds of beets, and we've discovered that the leaves of the golden beets, Touchstone is the variety that we grew, are absolutely delicious. So again, you can experiment and find out which one's your favorite. Our carrots are all in flower right now. They overwintered, no problem. Goldie seeded a 50-foot bed of carrots in August. Napoli was the variety that she chose. It was a short season carrot, went on to mature, and then she covered it with Rime for the winter, just against the carrot rust fly. And basically we ate carrots all winter long, and we actually provided carrots for a community dinner, a great big box of them. And they went round and asked farmers to donate food for the dinner, so we were able to donate carrots. And then we ended up digging out 60 pounds of carrots in March, I think it was, March. to free the bed up, and we left the end of the row to go to seed, which is huge, absolutely, wow, just enormous right now because of all the rain, massive seed heads on those carrots. So a lot of thing for seed saving with the root vegetables, it's biennial. That means that they go to seed in the second year. You have to get them through the winter. But we discovered that, again, with timing, get those carrots in August, and then they'll take you right through the winter, and extremely sweet and sugary, wonderful eating quality. And surprisingly, with root vegetables, when you leave them in the ground for a long time, you are risking damage. So there are little worms that will work their way in there. But we experienced very little of that, actually. Most of the carrots were in really good shape, but you can just dig out any of those. This is a picture of some of the turnips we talked about at the beginning of this talk. I bought this seed back from England, actually, because I was curious, and I thought, oh, you know, turnips, people turn their noses up at turnips, and I think of them as a fodder plant, and they just give them to livestock, and, like, you know, what's not even human food, that's rubbish, actually, because wow, when you grow these, not only are they a very fast growing crop, they're also extremely delicious, and I was quite surprised. They can be just chopped into chunks and steamed, or they can be mashed and combined with potatoes or cauliflower for a mashup. And again, it's about carbohydrate. You know, when you're thinking about what you're doing with eating winter vegetables, is you're getting all your vitamins from your leafy greens, and you're getting your energy, your carbohydrate, your warming nutrients from your root vegetables. So it's good to have things like turnips, celeriac, winterbaga, and there's some other root vegetables as well that I'd introduce you to. This is, they call them Jerusalem artichokes, which is extremely confusing for people, because it's really not an artichoke. And I don't know where the Jerusalem part came in, but a lot of people have started to refer to them as sunchokes, just to avoid confusion. This is definitely a permaculture plant. It's perennial. I always say to people who plant these in their garden, once you have it, you'll always have it, because they're a bit like bluebells. You can try digging them out, good luck, they always come back. But this was my little patch in my garden. It was only 4 by 6, and I stopped it from spreading because every year I would go to Seedy Saturday, starting in, well, now it's January, then it was February. The first show was always the first Saturday in February in Qualicum, but now they've got other Denman Island and the Horticultural Centre of the Pacific. They kick in with their seed shows in January now. But I'd go into the garden and I would dig up the entire patch. I would dig it out, stick my fork in there, and I would grow these red sunchokes. You can see how crowded they are. Every single year I would dig out the entire patch and fill 5-gallon buckets, wash them off, take them with me to the Seedy Saturday and sell them for $1.99 for 100 grams. And spread them throughout the community, and warn people about planting them, because wanting them to know how invasive they are. But this is a staple food. It's very healthy. It's got inulin in it, good for diabetics. It's very versatile. You can make soup from it. You can just have it as a crudite with a dip. Raw, you can marinate it. And you can roast them like potatoes, and they're extremely interesting flavor. They're quite nutty, and it's a good, wonderful in a mixed, I've got this in my cookbook, and in my Zero Mile Diet book, I think, a recipe for roasted vegetables, and I'll put the sunchokes in with the roasted vegetables. And I would throw quince or something like that in there to mix it up a little bit, and wow, amazing taste profile. Actually, the flavors really go together. This is a white sunchoke. The thing about the sunchokes is cleaning them. They're a little bit knobbly, as you can see. So they're better if they're bigger and less knobbly, easier to clean. But usually just take a vegetable brush and give them a good scrub out. And you can also, if you are worried about clean, a pot of boiling water, like sometimes I'll just throw my beets or my vegetables into a pot of boiling water just to, if I feel like I haven't quite cleaned them enough and there's still a trace of dirt from the garden on them, and I just want to be sure that I'm not going to get food poisoning or bacterial contamination from my food, because maybe you've added some manure or something to the garden and you're not quite sure, I'll just like do a pot of boiling water and just plunge them in there to sterilize them before going on and baking them. But so very, very sustainable sunchokes. And during World War II, people were very, very dependent on having this food source in their gardens. And a lot of people call them fartichokes because they're known, as with anything, when you start eating a new food thing that your digestive system's not used to, you want to start slow and gradually introduce it to your body so that the enzymes and your digestive system can cope with it, and not suddenly go nuts. Like, you know, I'd go home to visit my parents and I'd be making bean dishes for them and they go crazy farting. And that's because they hardly ever ate beans. So, whoops, I was very unpopular. But, and then they would say to me, how can you eat this food? And I say, well, I don't have that problem because it's a regular part of my diet and my system can cope with it. This is something from New Zealand that some of you may have encountered or may not have encountered. They're called New Zealand yams, or oca, O-C-A. And again, wow, they're very prolific, and they're in the winter. The base of the roots of the oca plant swells up to form these edible tubers. And they taste like carrots with a hit of lemon. This is the foliage. So oca makes a really nice ground cover. You can see that it's related to oxalis from the foliage. And so it's very attractive as a ground cover. This you would have growing during the year, and then later in the season it would all die back. The tops would freeze out in November, and then you'd wait, and then the oca tubers would develop underneath the foliage. And I would just roast the oca in the oven, and drizzled with a little bit of olive oil and put some garlic cloves in there. And wow, we love this. It's carrots with a hit of lemon, really tasty and very productive, and also extremely lucrative, because when these caught on at CD Saturday, I would dig up a bunch of tubers from the garden to distribute at CDC. Value went up, and now people were paying $3 for one tuber. So, you know, from a financial perspective, they were really rewarding. These are called Krosny's, Chinese artichokes. I don't know why they call everything artichokes. It's very confusing. They remind me of the Michelin rubber, the Michelin tire guy. They're very strange looking. Now in France, if you go to a farmer's market, you would pay a lot of money to get these. I had to go to the Maritimes to order them from a nursery on the East Coast, and they're in the Stachys family. And they are also something where when the foliage dies down, the root swells to form these edible tubers. And again, it's a speciality thing, but anything which is edible, I think, is worth it when you're looking for things to eat or if you need things to eat. Anything that reproduces and multiplies like crazy is a sustainable thing. And having this stuff in our gardens and on the island is all about cementing food security, to have it there. Even if our generation doesn't take advantage of this, future generations may thank us that we left them the legacy of having these perennial food plants available to them in the future. Who knows what's going to happen? So this is the onions, the overwintering onions, when they come out of the ground after the winter harvest. A walla walla is a sweet onion and not a storage onion, so you would just eat that after harvest. And my favorites is the leeks, and we just punch a 6-inch hole into the ground and drop the leek seedling into the hole. And then over the growing season, as they're watered in or as it rains, the soil falls into the hole and blanches. So that way you get your 6-inch blanched, tender base of your leek, which is the most desirable part of the vegetable. And the longer you leave them, the fatter they get. But there's a point at which, as we go into the spring, they actually get woody and more fibrous-y, and they start to go to seed. And at that point, the eating quality is not very good. So when I go to the supermarket, sometimes I see these giant leeks and I don't bother buying them, because I think they're not going to be tender and they're going to be too fibrous-y, because they're just going to seed. And the best time to eat them and harvest them is actually when they're young and tender and not so old and gnarled. So here's a trick for you with leeks. I got to the point when I was harvesting them, when I wouldn't pull them out of the ground, I just took a knife and I just sliced them off, left the roots in the ground, and they would come back. And this is the comeback. And so then they'd multiply. And so one leek would now produce 2 or 3 leeks. And so you would have a second flush of leek production. And you can try that with your cabbages as well. I've actually done that with my cabbages. I've left the roots in the ground, sliced off the head of the cabbage, and I've got 5 or 6 baby cabbages as a result of that. So still increased food production. And we're talking about alliums now, onions, and this is the perennial bunching onion, which is another one of those things that you never need to buy green onions again if you have these perennial bunching onions in your garden. They are multipliers, and so from one you'll get a whole bunch of them. This is the Welsh bunching onion, and it's just started with one, and you can see how it divides and multiplies each one of those onions. And again, I started out, I would divide these and then put a whole row of them in, and then the whole row of single onions would end up as a bunch of multiplier onions. And then I would split them, pop them up and sell them at my winter vegetable sale as a perennial onion. And then just had them for years in my garden, and they're just dotted around, and kept on dividing them and separating them and sharing them. So again, a sustainable onion. You never have to have green onions again. So yeah, basically, if you go to page 185 in my book, it's got a recap of all the information that we just talked about, and a seeding schedule and some tips for winter vegetables. But it is actually one of the most easiest thing to grow, is the winter vegetables. Okay, so you're all back with me now. So we got any questions about any of that information? And I probably forgot some things too. Yes, Carla.
Just a question about punnets. Where do you buy punnets from? If you're thinking you may sell some seedlings.
Right. Yes, you can buy them in sheets. I think they cost about $1.49 or something, or to $1.99 for a sheet of 12, from somewhere like Buckerfields or from any garden centre, actually. Art Naps, Plantland in Nanaimo on Wednesdays. Oh, I think you're not seniors, right? They have a 20% off seniors discount. Um, yeah, so that's a good time to go shopping at Art Naps. But yeah, you can find them new. I usually buy them by the box full. If anybody wants some, actually, I think I might even have some sheets. I'll have a look and see. I can bring some with me this afternoon. Recycled, if you want some recycled ones for free, I mean, I can just bring, you can come back to my place and grab a whole bunch of them. I've got tons of them. So in the beginning, I have a little bit of a beef about this plastics thing, because when the price of oil shot through the roof years ago, all the petroleum products also went through the roof. And that included all the plastic pots and plastic trays and everything that you ended up purchasing. So, you know, we would buy boxes from Integrity Sales and Distributors, like with 100 of these trays of punnets in at a time, which would obviously bring the price down. But then the prices of all these things started skyrocketing, and it like was 10 cents per thing. You know, a little pot would cost, you know, 15 cents for just one little 3¼ inch plastic pot. Yeah, and accordingly, everybody put their prices up, you know, to cover for the cost of the packaging. But they made these things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to keep the price down. And so in the beginning, when I started my business, I used recycled pots all the time, and they were through the community. People would take them to the municipal works yards and dump them off. You could pick them up. The garden centres had a return thing where you could actually return your plastics and other people could come and take them. So, you know, I would clean them up and use all recycled, and they were of the quality and caliber of plastic that could be used again. But now they make them so thin and so flimsy that they rip, and they're only designed for one season's use, which is ridiculous. So once again, you know, you get what you pay for. Yeah, frustrating that. Yeah, but if anybody wants any gallon pots or plastics, let me know, because I do have still quite a few. Yes, Lenica.
I'm wondering about using my greenhouse through the winter for my like broccolis, my rab, things like that. Do you think they'll overwinter better in there?
No, I think they'll be better off outside in the ground, in the garden. But you've got soil in your greenhouse, don't you?
Yep.
Yeah, okay then. Well, the rab is a really fast crop. It comes quite well. It'll be a little bit slower in the winter because of cooler conditions. I do think those brassicas are happier outside than inside. The leafy greens and things like that. What I'd say to that is probably if you have space, and if you, because they end up getting quite big, those plants, so they take quite a bit of room. I would prioritize a diversity of other things which don't take so much room, and then put the large space hogging things out in the garden.
So maybe put my greens, like green onions or corn salad, that kind of stuff inside.
Well, again, all those things can grow quite happily out in the garden. Your green onions, yes, they may be both. I mean, they're a quick crop too. What you can do is experiment.
Okay.
And try some things in the greenhouse. But things like cabbages and cauliflowers and broccoli, probably those things will be happier outside.
Okay.
Other things, if you want to grow them outside and you're sort of questioning like, oh, I wish I had a greenhouse, or I, you know, wish I could protect them, that's when building a cold frame around them comes in useful. because if we suddenly got hit with a deep, we're not really getting much snow in the winter at all. And when we do get snow, you have to remember it looks pretty harsh out there, but it's insulating. So when the snow's on the ground and the vegetables are covered, they're actually insulated. And it's no good with your impulse to rush out there and protect them or to pick them and bring them in. It's no good, because the plant actually will go into lockdown, will go into deep freeze. And then what it needs is to be left alone to thaw out slowly in the ground without any interference. So I showed you that picture of the corn salad in deep freeze. I mean, it looked dead. And it's just like, oh my God, you know, that's the end of my corn salad. But no, actually, it's not. It sailed through and bounced back and, you know, became perky again. So, yeah. The best thing is not to interfere, but for some things like the lettuces, they can definitely get frozen out. To put something over them, like a cloche, you know, build a hoop frame with some plastic protection. That would be a good thing if you're not sure. And as Goldie has kind of showed us, it's about pest protection too. If you don't care about holes in the leaves or the edges being nibbled a little bit or the odd worm, that broccoli that I picked yesterday, I always soak my broccoli in a bowl of water before I eat it, because invariably there will be a worm comes out of it. And you can't see those worms, but they live in there. And sure enough, I soaked them and a worm came out. So, you know, if you want to protect your food from things like that, then it's a good idea to cover them. Yeah. Jane?
Carolyn,
Yeah.
do you grow anything in your greenhouse in the wintertime?
Well, they've got the boxes, which I'll fill with a biologically active compost mix. And I can grow anything I want in there. So I will grow lots of things like I showed you, I grew the peas, and then we would eat pea shoots. That's a quick crop. I would do lettuces, well, actually a bunch of leafy greens, mustard greens, chard, just because in my garden, actually, I don't really have a garden to grow food in. It's all ornamental, little pockets, rockery garden, and it's mostly ornamental. So yes, you can grow a lot of things in a planter box or a big black plastic pot. Oh, chard, for example, no problem. But, you know, having said that, you can also grow chard outside your front door in a big black plastic pot too. The coloured chard is very attractive, and then you can just open the door and pick dinner. And for the herbs, I love parsley, so I'm happy. I mean, parsley is fine. Again, it'll go through the winter outside. So what happens with the parsley, or what happens like it was with alpine plants, is that they're cold. I mean, you know, they want to hog the ground. So they're not really fully flushing out and active above the ground. They're sort of hunkered down. And what happens as a result, we'll just talk about parsley, the flavor intensifies because you've got a smaller, more coarse plant that's protecting itself against freezing, and you've got intensified flavor there. So I love herbs, perennial herbs in the winter time. Yeah, and I like to add that to a lot of things, like because of the vitamin C. But you know, I'd say experiment. There's only one thing to be aware of about growing things in raised beds and planter boxes is pill bugs. You know, because where there's wet, rotting wood, there is going to be a pill bug around because they live on that stuff. And so you want to just be careful checking against gnawing and damage from, say, pill bug build-up. Yeah, that's the best thing. Or if somehow slugs manage to find their way in to your greenhouse, you want to look out. They'll be all over your boxes if they can get in there. I think Pam and Ross have found that, Sophia, with their lettuces, and they've got a raised bed. And it looks like your lettuces have outgrown the slug problem, but they had to be on top of it. Take the slugs off. Yeah. But we should actually end up seeing a relief now from slugs as we get hotter. We should be going into summer soon, so that the slug damage should abate somewhat. Yeah. And again, mostly like we're talking about nitrogen here. So I didn't say that when you follow one crop on, for example, your peas, where you've grown your peas, they'll be done. And you'll be pulling out your peas. And by the way, when you pull out your peas, you can just cut them off at the ground and leave the roots in the soil, because they're legumes and they've actually got the nitrogen fixing rhizobacteria in their roots. And if you pull out the roots, then you're removing that from the soil. And that is a good thing for the follow-on crop. And so, for example, if you follow your pea crop with your kale or chard or collards, I didn't actually even talk about collards, did I? Collards are non-heading cabbage leafy greens. I love collards, they're really sweet, and I would recommend growing them as a winter crop. You've got that nitrogen in the soil from your peas as a follow-on. Yeah, so that's a good thing to do. And your garlic will be coming out in July, and so then you want to feed your soil after the garlic, because it will have taken out most of the nutrient, and bring in some aged manure or some compost, and just work that in lightly, board fork it in or just turn it under a little bit, and then let your bed sit before you put your transplants in or direct seed in it. And I didn't say that there's a cutoff here. Mid-September is the cutoff. Your plants actually have to be well established before they get hit with the severe frost. Normally we don't get severe frost until November. So you've got September and October for let's just say you're transplanting, right? For your transplants to get rooted and established. And the key thing is that they need to have time to put on growth in order to be well rooted by the time that hard frosts hit in November. Otherwise, they might not get through the winter. So timing is everything. Yeah. And, you know, at the end of the day, just building a frame over something, if you're worried about it, you can just literally put your supports over the top of your bed and then just put some plastic over that. I just use vapor barrier. Some places sell bulk plastic, 6mm poly is what's recommended, and you can buy it right off the roll and you can tell them how much you want. But for $30 you can buy a 60-foot roll of 8.5-foot wide vapor barrier, which is 6mm poly, and it's also UV resistant, and that is got to be good for a couple of years minimum as a greenhouse or a sort of a temporary protected frame. And I think I showed you my pictures of my pallet system where we actually built pallets with shelves on them and then covered it with the poly, and that's a good temporary overwintering thing to protect plants. Yeah. I said
the carrots that we've got in now in the summertime, as they are being harvested and we're reseeding them, that carrot bed will stay the same carrot bed all through the winter, right?
Yeah, if you're reseeding now in the summertime, then that's it. You're just going to have the same carrots right through the winter.
Okay, so I thought I would do that with the Swiss char as well, but you just said to put the Swiss char in the pea bed. So I
Oh
wondered
no,
if is there
I'm just
anything else to go in the pea bed? I'm wondering about these different families of plants. I've been trying this year to make sure I'm not mixing them around.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, your brassicas is all your kale, and your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower they're all brassicas. And your beets and your chard, they're in Chenopodiaceae family. That's a different family. So if you're doing crop rotations, you can block them like that. But what I'm saying to you actually is that if you've already got chard growing, and if you've already got kale growing, you probably don't need to grow those. If you have enough of them, that will take you right through the winter. So you probably don't need to grow more of it unless you want more of it. Sometimes there's lots of things like that you grow at the start of the year that will actually, like the leeks, for example, if you grow overwintering leeks, like they're going to mature and they'll be harvestable in fall. But if they're overwintering, you just leave them in and they'll just sail right through the winter for you. Same with your parsley and stuff like that. And then you've got all your quick seeding crops, like you can add your salad turnips and your radishes and things like that. That could be just a fast little crop that comes in and out, 28 days. You can just seed some of that stuff just so that you've got something to fill in those October, November months. But those things won't sail. Well, I'm not saying they won't, I'm saying they might not, and we don't know what kind of winter we're going to have. But like last winter, Goldie had green onions, Lineker, and she had them in the field, and they went right through the winter. And then we actually allowed them to go to seed in the spring. So, they didn't have any protection. Now, had they had protection, they probably would have been a lot happier. They looked a little bit ragged, but they were still edible. Yeah. So I think it's an experiment thing. Like, there's a lot of different plants to play around with, to try. Again, I always say to people, grow what you and your family most like to eat. And if you are short of space, then buy the space hogging things from somewhere else. Maybe you don't have room for winter squash to sprawl all over the place. Well, you could go to the farmer's market or McNabb's or something like that, and you could just buy winter squash from them. But I've actually been shocked I paid $6.50 for one spaghetti squash this winter, and I was like, oh, forget that. That's ridiculous. I can grow these things like weeds. I don't have to pay all this money for one spaghetti squash. It seems excessive to me. But maybe at the end of the day, the end of this year, we can share some of our extra stuff with you. Well, now that Goldie's all jumping up and down with excitement because of the farm stand, because the food is disappearing so fast. She's suddenly got really excited about growing more food. Ka-ching, ka-ching. But who knows how much stuff we'll have left at the end of the day. But it would be nice to be able to share. If some of us have got excess of this, that, or the other, we could do a little gathering and a trade up, Anyway, you'll be happy to know that the pickling cucumbers look great. And maybe we'll tie them up later. They're in, but they just need tying up, so we can do some things like that. Yeah. So I don't know what time it is. Oh yes, okay, well, we're at our time thing, 11 o'clock. Any other questions about winter veggies? No, all good then. Sydney, are you coming up or are you going to stay down today?
No, I'm coming up.
Oh, you are? Oh, all right. Oh, this is exciting.
Well, it takes like an hour and a half to get up there, and you said you're starting at 1, right?
Yeah, and you can make it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Good. How are you doing?
I'm
Are you
good.
back?
I'm really tired.
Oh, you
So I slept in by accident, which is why I missed the beginning.
Oh, well, that's okay. Well, we actually recorded it actually for Ashley, who's, I think she's doing something else right now. She's at school.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I talked about you yesterday, Abby, because we had all the CSNN school students here. And a couple of them expressed interest in doing the farm school next year. So, and yeah, I think it's a really, yeah, they're just finishing now. So they're all excited because they're right at the end of the program.
Yeah.
And Sophia's signed up to do the CSNN School of Natural Nutrition program for next year. So
Right on.
that's great. Yeah, it's complementation. Nutrition is what it's all about, really, isn't it? And it was very interesting. The students did an assignment. We can talk about this when we're seeding winter veggies on the impacts of COVID-19 on the food system, and all sorts of things came to light. The frailties of the system. And yeah, I talked about this already. And the shortages haven't really shown up yet. The disruption hasn't made itself felt, but yeah, we're going to see some impact for sure as we go through the food year. So having more food around is going to be a really good thing. Okay, I'm going to love you and leave you and see you all at 1 o'clock, those who are coming, and hopefully you got some inspiration out of the winter vegetable talk. And we'll see you later. Okay, bye. Bye, Lorraine. Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.